How's everybody doing?
Good.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you guys for being here. Really, really appreciate it. Can everybody see the screen okay?
Yep.
Perfect. I'm gonna move this little guy around so I can see here. There you go. Cool. So I'll go ahead and get started. I'm gonna do just a short overview here of what we're gonna talk about. And then at the beginning, I'm gonna ask for kind of what your guys' questions are. I have way more slides than I'll ever want to cover, but I want to make sure that since we're doing this live, that I actually answer your particular questions. I got these two topics by asking the old Chat GPT what it thought were two kind of controversial topics in fitness still. And to my surprise, it still said carbohydrates, sleep, and caffeine, which I thought was interesting. I was like, oh, well, that works out pretty good since I've presented a ton of stuff on those already. So thank you very much for being here. Really appreciate this. It's myself and my wife Jody from a while ago. So carbohydrates, if you've been in the fitness industry long enough, you've seen, oh, they're horrible. Or wait, oh no, they're great. Oh no, wait, now they're horrible. Now they're good. Now they're bad. But I would say most athletes I know are using carbohydrates to their advantage. We know that they actually can help with recovery. And if you're doing more work, like if you look at especially CrossFit athletes who do a lot of work or professional athletes, almost all of them are fueled by carbohydrates. So I think you can definitely make an argument that they are beneficial. It's just how you would actually use them. So related to carbohydrates, and we'll get into sleep and caffeine real quick next. What questions do you have? I'll do the first half of the presentation talking about carbohydrates a little bit, and the second half about sleep and caffeine. But what questions do you have about carbohydrates that you would like an answer to? And you'll probably have to unmute yourself because I think I muted everyone when they came in. Oh, there's a chat feature I'm not looking at. What are the best sources? Okay, so we got sources. Cool. If that's Ryan, it's definitely keto cereal is very high in carbs. Cool. What other questions do you guys have? You can unmute if you want, or you can send it to the chat. Timing of carbohydrates. Got it. And related to timing, any particular athlete, Rena, or just in general? In general. Okay, cool. That works. Any other questions related to carbohydrates? And we'll do a little time for questions at the end too. Going once, going twice. Everyone's quiet. All right. Well, if you think of it, we will come back and we'll definitely have more questions on that. So for part two of the presentation, sleep versus caffeine, your habits helping or hurting. We'll talk a little bit about coffee if it's bad. It just seems like coffee gets demonized all the time, per se. And the main part of the presentation, I've got a whole bunch of data, is how do you kind of balance looking at sleep versus the use of different stimulants and caffeine? And then if people really want it, we have some data on the pharmacology of caffeine, how long it stays active, etc. Things that may inhibit it or things that may prolong it. But related to caffeine and sleep, what other questions do you guys have? Oh, looks like we had some other questions here about glycation for carbohydrates, different effects of complex carbs per meal versus carb before workout, so timing. cool. Got it. Any questions in general about sleep and caffeine?
Is there a difference in type of caffeine and how it affects us?
Ah, cool. In terms of like sources or different like subsets of caffeine, like paraxanthine or
I was thinking more sources, but both maybe.
okay, got it. So sources. Cool. Awesome. What else do you guys got? How caffeine interacts with other nutrients? Okay, cool. In terms of potential depletion, that type of thing.
Yeah, I've heard a lot about like caffeine with like L-theanine and
Oh, sure. Yeah, yeah.
stuff like that. So just how like what you're eating with it, or what else besides just the caffeine is influencing how it makes you feel, how it interacts or interferes with sleep.
Got it. Cool. Can do. So amounts and timing. Yep, got it. Benefit of caffeine negatively affect the benefits of creatine. That's a good one. My bias on that is probably not, although there was some early research that kind of goes back and forth, but I'd say probably not on that, but it's a good question. Can you flush caffeine out of your system through exercise or drinking more water? It's a good question. The short answer is probably not. So there is a drug that there's only one drug I found that'll speed up sort of caffeine metabolism. So I got a slide on that if people are interested. Opinions on the nap cappuccino, so caffeine power naps. Cool. That's a good one. Anything else? Going once, going twice. Cool. All right. So, we'll come back to some of this. This is just if people had questions on that, sustain energy, and so on. So, as most of you know, like the background I view carbohydrates at is from metabolic flexibility, which I've been looking at for well over 12 years now. The goal is with this to kind of in science, your goal is always to try to disprove whatever model that you have. And so the model that originally people think about is they tend to think only on one side of the spectrum. We've got like our barbell here with our carbohydrates here, and then maybe our fat metabolism on the other side. But people, especially in the fitness world, think, oh, we just need to do a high fat diet with keto only. Carbs are bad, or we just need to do only carbohydrates, not really fat. So with metabolic flexibility, you want to be able to use carbohydrates, you want to be able to use fat, and you want to be able to switch back and forth between both of them is a good model, in my opinion, for health and also for performance. Real briefly, I always like including a slide about overload. The main reason is if you get overload, so obviously this is in the context of training and exercise, which we won't talk about today, but the reason I think carbohydrates get vilified so much is people are assuming that you're not active. And so when you're active and when you have overload, that changes your body's ability to handle carbohydrates. And what we find is these are little mouse studies where they used to do hind limb tail suspension. And so little mice had to walk around on their front legs all the time. Or you may have never seen the old squatting mouse study. I actually have a little electrical stimulator hooked up to get the little guys to squat up and down. But what they find is if they have enough overload, that the muscles always get stronger and always get bigger, even if they do lots of cruel things to them, like put them on low protein diets, castrate them, etc. So the key here is that if the muscles are under some load of exercise and working, that dramatically changes the landscape and how well your body will handle carbohydrates. If your butt just looks like a couch cushion all the time and your exercise is pressing buttons on your remote, carbohydrates may not necessarily be the best for you, but we're not talking about that particular context. And again, stress can be in all different forms. It could be some form of exercise. You could want to play with like heavy, weird shaped dumbbells like I do there. Maybe stress like you're running from an alligator, live in Florida. testing weird sort of supplements you may not have had before. It's definitely very stressful. This one is one of the first ketones ever made. It tasted ungodly horrible, and I almost threw it up in my sink, but the guy who sent it me said, don't do that because it's like several $1,000s for just a couple ounces I sent you. So we know that physiology is complex, but your actions are going to be relatively simple. So our goal here is to talk a little bit about the physiology that's complex, but at the end of the day, translate it to actions that are going to be rather simple. And we talked about the context of metabolic flexibility. So if you look at a formal definition of it, I like the top one here. Capacity for skeletal muscle to acutely shift its reliance between lipids and glucose during fasting or response to insulin, such as postprandial conditions, which sounds like a whole bunch of kind of mumbo jumbo. So as we mentioned, we're looking at primarily skeletal muscle, which is the main active organ there, and how well it can shift between lipids, so use of fat, and carbohydrates or glucose in response to fasting, so a period of time where there's no food coming in, response to insulin, such as postprandial conditions, so after you eat. So we can think of insulin as sort of this fuel selector switch. Insulin is higher after a meal, especially a meal with carbohydrates. You're going to try to oxidize or use more glucose, more carbohydrates. If insulin is low, such as after a longer period of fasting, your body's going to want to try to use more lipids in that case. This is also hypothesized to play a role in various disease processes. So David Kelly was the first researcher to coin the term metabolic flexibility. Different topic for a different time, but most people actually have an impaired fatty acid oxidation. They need to teach their body how to use fat better in addition to carbohydrate use. So this is insulin we're talking about here. I like the fuel selector switch, which I blatantly stole from Jeff Volek. As I mentioned, higher levels of insulin will actually push your body to use or to oxidize more carbohydrates. So again, insulin isn't in and of itself a bad thing. Lower insulin will push your body to primarily use more fat as a fuel source. So our framework for all of this is that even when you're talking about carbohydrates, most people are still talking about it in the realm of performance or body composition. This is just a review slide of what we just said from before. Yes, calories matter. We're not going to spend a whole bunch of time on that. I always feel like I have to throw this slide in every time now because otherwise I'll get 5 emails from people that are like, oh, but you didn't mention calories and you're saying they don't matter. And like, nope, calories still matter, but this is within the framework of that. This is what's called the crossover effect from Brooks and Mercier. It was 1992, 94, I was close. And what it's just saying is that if we're at rest, how well we're using carbohydrates and how many is really not a whole lot. We should primarily be using fat. But as we increase exercise intensity here, we get to the point where we're almost 100% use of carbohydrates under high intense exercise. So again, exercise, we want the ability to use carbohydrates for some type of exercise performance. So if you've ever done a very low carbohydrate diet and remove carbohydrates from your diet, and you try to do a lot of high-end speed and power, it definitely doesn't feel good, and performance will definitely be lower because of that. This is just a review of metabolic flexibility. And so we'll get to what is actually some of the more practical stuff you can actually do. The only reason I include this slide is this is a very cool study from George Brooks's lab. And what it's saying is that if you are not as well trained, so this is looking at trained versus recreational people, they're looking at fat oxidation on this side, and they're using blood lactate as a surrogate marker for carbohydrates, which is, pretty good. We can see that in the highly trained person up here, they're able to hit like high levels of output, around, well over almost close to 400 watts. Someone who's not as trained, they barely hit 300. And where this crossover point is here, this is the point where you're using 50% fat, 50% carbohydrates, occurs at 2 completely different places. So in English, what this means is, again, by training and increasing the amount of power you can create, you can move this point further and train your body to get better at using both carbohydrates and also at using fat. And so I think this gets lost a lot of time when we're talking about exercise, carbohydrates, and fat oxidation. In English, if you just have a bigger engine, you're going to get more power output and you're going to be able to burn through a lot more fuel, both fat and carbohydrates. So that's what that's based on there. Yeah, I'm going to skip that for now. The same thing, just showing the health and related. This is one I wanted to talk about briefly is this is from Atkinson, and what they showed was that when you gave people a huge amount of carbohydrates, it actually suppressed fatty acid use, and that this also may influence satiety. So again, even if you are using more carbohydrates, again, this is not necessarily a bad thing. You can still operate by using higher amounts of carbohydrates. This was a study where they purposely overfed people and they didn't get super fat and all these horrible things happened to them. So we're going to talk about my best way for using carbohydrates is lift stuff with carbohydrates. Have some carbohydrates around intense exercise. Now, if you have a background that's higher in amounts of carbohydrates, this is pretty easy. Again, this is assuming your goal is some fat loss. We can argue about should that happen during training, fasted cardio versus intervals. I like to think of exercise as some level of output. And for the most part, we want to maximize the output that your body is doing. So for as long as possible, I like having athletes have carbohydrates around intense exercise and having more in terms of a background, especially from their calories. Again, if we want more fat loss, we might do some more fasted cardio. We might do periods of time where we're cutting back on calories, but we would not necessarily be doing high intense exercise at that point. We want to do what's called macro matching. We want to match the macronutrients in the background to the exercise that we're doing. If you're doing a low to moderate level, let's say just cardio, you don't really need carbohydrates for that. Fat's going to be a better fuel. But if you're going to go to the gym and lift some heavy stuff, then you want performance to be number one and use those other periods of time where you're not as active to serve more for fat loss at that point. So again, we're looking at fat loss as more of a 24-hour process, over days, weeks, months, etc. So handling carbohydrates. So method number one, if you're more metabolically flexible, you can actually switch back to using fat sooner once you leave the gym, right? Because you're at the gym using carbohydrates, and then you can switch back to using fat once you're done. So in theory, your resting metabolic rate or NEAT or these other movements, those are more use of fat, but you're still using carbohydrates to power more intense training because that's what's going to lead to more body comp changes over time. So if you're focused on weight training and high intensity exercise, I do like carbohydrates during the lifting period. You could go with more fats during the rest of the time or lower carbohydrates or, smaller amounts of fruit and veggies and things like that. Again, this all just depends on where you're actually at for those background. But normally what I see is people do a fat loss based approach and they just radically drop carbohydrates all out of their diet and then their performance drops too hard and then they can't figure out why they stalled out after a couple weeks. So method number one, carbohydrates around exercise. Again, there's no magical number, but I like 20 to 30 grams of, you could use like a whey protein, 40 to 80 grams of carbohydrates. Again, you could use different things. I do like a little bit higher GI, more just because of digestive issues. And this doesn't need to be right before. This could be 30 to 120 minutes before. So if you're eating 4 times a day, this could just simply be a meal that's higher in carbohydrates beforehand. You could use supplements if you want. You could use egg whites and dried dates. And you could use whey protein and a spotted banana. There's all sorts of different things you can do. Most of this is not necessarily based on GI. It's just making sure your digestion feels good when you go to train. And the spotted banana is not some weird exotic banana. It's just a ripe banana. I've had a couple people ask and they're like, where do you get these spotted bananas? I'm like, It's just a ripe banana. So nothing magical about that. And then after, right around the same. Probably same thing. And eat when you can. There's no magical to any timing or anything. I find whole foods generally are tolerated better because you're not having any movement after, so you don't need to be as concerned about any GI stuff. 4 to 8 ounces of chicken breast, green beans, sweet potato, nothing crazy. Steak, asparagus, white rice. Or if you're really in a hurry, like I have some clients who, 2 of their meals are kind of more supplement based and 2 are more whole foods just because of their schedule. You could have 20 to 40 grams of whey and a large spotted banana. You can literally leave that in your car, drink it on the way home or wherever you're going to next. So that's what I like for carbs around exercise. There is no real magical anabolic window. It does stay open for a period of time. But however, if you're eating, let's say 4 times a day, you're probably going to have 1 or 2 of those meals are just going to end up being before and after training. So that's where I would like to have more carbohydrates if you have the choice. Again, if your background is 400 grams of carbohydrates, it's not going to matter a whole lot. You're still going to have a bunch before and after training. But as your calories get lower, and maybe you're only at 200 grams of carbohydrates, having some more before and after training is going to be more beneficial at that point. Also, people forget insulin is a potent vasodilator, so it works good for increasing local blood flow. Again, there's a ton of data on that. So having more carbohydrates can help with that. So some of the questions about sources. I mean, any carbohydrates I like that are whole foods to start with. I don't really think there's any bad carbohydrates. It's just how much micronutrition are you going to get in it and how much other fiber. So if you have more fruits and vegetables and things like that, or even, white rice, you're going to get more micronutrients and stuff there versus Skittles, right? So that'd be my preference on that. Timing, we talked a little bit about. There's no magic rules on timing unless you're doing like a 2 a day or the second session. Then you probably need to have more concern about what type of carbohydrates you're using. So you may only have like 2 hours to replenish glycogen. For those kind of scenarios, I do like Vitargo or kind of very fast acting carbohydrates. But most of the time, it's not going to matter a lot. It's usually digestion that's going to be your rate limiter on that. So things you can easily digest, you feel good. That's what I would go with. So type of that, carb source, timing. So glycation, yeah, in theory, you can measure this by looking at different markers for it, or something called AGEs. I think that is obviously nutrition related, but I think a lot of it is just too many piss poor calories in the face of having too small of an engine to burn anything. That's usually where I see these advanced glycation end products become more of an issue. I have seen them in some athletes, but it's relatively rare. So I think if you're cycling through and you're burning a fair amount of calories, I don't really worry too much about glycation products. So, any other questions on the crash course on carbohydrates I can answer for people? Everybody's very quiet. Oops, sorry, I just hit somebody's button there. I don't know what I did, so sorry about that. Shows how good I'm at using that Zoom, which is not very good.
Do you find that a lot of people after like higher carbohydrate meals tend to feel like sleepy? Like so like that intermediate window before training, it's like high carb meal, sleepy, and then trying to go train.
Sometimes, if they do, to me, that's kind of a marker that something's kind of funky. I'd want to know more about how well they can use carbohydrates. The first question I would ask is it different at different times of the day and different meals? If it is, then I'm going to probably change up what they're having as a meal before training. Sometimes if they're, the glycemic index isn't really the best thing ever, but sometimes if they have higher glycemic index carbs, they can have their blood glucose drop a little bit more and not feel as good. It's highly dependent on the individual. So I would first look at, does it happen after every meal or is it just certain meals? If it's certain meals, I'm going to look at what's in that meal and change that up and see if we can get around that. If it's every meal, then I'm going to look at just maybe some fasting blood glucose, some other blood work, like how do they feel overall? Where is their aerobic base? Where is their strength levels, stress, those types of things. Another thing you can do too that works really well is do a very short walk after a meal. Sometimes people just don't get enough movement during the day. So if you walk or do any type of muscle contraction, you can literally pull glucose directly out of the bloodstream by what's called non-insulin mediated mechanics. So you don't even need insulin to do that. Just contracting muscle will pull glucose directly out of the bloodstream. So that would be another option on that too.
Thanks.
Yeah, all good. Age-related. Oh, is there any age-related effects of youth versus 50? In general, I would say people who are older tend to be not as carbohydrate tolerant. Although I would argue that I think most of that is activity related to and just general muscle mass. If you look at just younger kids in general, they just tend to move a whole lot more. Adults, or even myself, like most of my stuff is online. So I kind of have to like really program myself to go walking, especially when it's snowing and stuff outside like it is today. So yeah, I do see that there is probably an age difference overall, although I do think that's more related to muscle mass and movement than age per se. So, very good question. Any other questions on that part? Going once, going twice. Cool. All right, so we'll move on to talk a little bit about sleep and answer some caffeine questions here. I always thought this was interesting. Again, we have this in the Flex Diet Cert. Dolphins have what's called unihemispheric slow wave sleep. Because like, you've ever seen a dolphin actually sleep? So within a 24-hour period, each half of their brain gets about 4 hours of slow wave sleep. So they actually will switch back and forth from one side of their brain to the other side of their brain, which I thought that was, I don't know why, I just found that pretty fascinating. Just get my slides to go here. I have this in the Flex Diet Cert too, so I'm not going to go over all of it, but there was actually a record for the longest period of time without any sleep. This is a DJ named Randy Gardner. This is actually scientifically documented in the Guinness World Book of Records. Was not using any stimulants of any kind. In 1964, stayed awake for 11 days and 25 minutes, which is bonkers. This world record was later outlawed because they said it was too dangerous. Now, considering all the other weird stuff like Guinness Book of Records does, like lack of sleep was considered too dangerous for them to continue on this. One side note on this is that even after a couple days, he started having hallucinations. By the end of it, he was completely out of it. And they said, oh, and this is someone who's being monitored the whole time. So they said, nope, that's too dangerous. We're not having you ever do that again. So normally when you give a sleep management course, this is what happens, but we'll talk about some caffeine stuff too. So on this, day 3, I already had moodiness, signs of ataxia, which was just an ability to do some repeated tongue twisters. Day 4, became more irritable, uncooperative. Day 11, I did what's called a Series 7 test. Respondents started with 100 and proceeded to count down and subtract by 7 each time. He only got to 65 with only 5 subtractions and then stopped. And then he asked why he had stopped, claimed he couldn't remember what he was doing or where he even was. So lots of really horrible stuff goes bad and even to worse when we don't sleep. There's lots of even just total cost to society. They believe that the oil spill of Exxon Valdez was due to sleep issues. Chernobyl accident and potentially even the space shuttle were all related to sleep costs. So normally you mention sleep, people think, oh, well, I'll just use more caffeine. So I've often joked that caffeine is the credit card of sleep. Like, yeah, it's going to work in the short period of time, but you're going to have to repay it at some point, right? It's not a magical thing that's going to replace sleep forever and ever with no consequences, as much as I love caffeine. One of the questions that comes up then is coffee itself unsafe? The short answer is nope. They've done what they call umbrella reviews of meta-analyses. So as you know, a meta-analysis is a compilation of different studies put into one study. So they may take, 10, 20, 30 or more studies, look at all the data, pool all the data together. It's ironic that this researcher's name is Pool, and then say, hey, here's our meta-analysis on this. An umbrella review is literally a meta-analysis of meta-analyses. We're taking multiple reviews of multiple studies combined. So if you want something that's even above a meta-analysis, that's what's called an umbrella review of meta-analyses. And in this one, they concluded caffeine consumption is generally safe within, certain limits. So no data there to say that it was bad. I do like coffee. They did another one. They said the 59 unique outcomes examined of 112 meta-analyses of observational studies. So they literally took over 100 meta-analyses of observational studies. Coffee was associated with a probable decrease of breast, colorectal, colon, endometrial, and prostate cancers, cardiovascular disease, mortality, Parkinson's disease, and type 2 diabetes. So it actually showed the opposite effect. Again, this was, of course, in moderation. Cancer risk, not associated with any overall cancer risk. That one's been proposed multiple times. Risk of dementia and Alzheimer's, that has not been supported by any of the data there. So coffee in general has been shown to be relatively safe, may even be the second highest antioxidant in most people's diet. So coffee in general, very, very safe. So we talk about the main component within coffee that people like, in addition to the taste, is caffeine. Is also a really good album by Faith No More that doesn't get quite enough love. So back to, I want to have a last couple of things on coffee here. For cardiovascular disease, moderate consumption of coffee, 3 to 5 cups per day, was associated with lower cardiovascular disease risk. So heavy consumption was neither associated with a higher nor lower risk of CVD. So at some point, it looks like it just becomes more neutral at that point. So basically, heart health, no need to really worry about that per se. So coffee, good stuff for you. Last couple of things here. Maybe we'll talk about caffeine, I promise. NAFLD, probably a decrease in that. So it's non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. In general, coffee is safe and probably has a fair amount of health benefits to it. There's a whole bunch of references there if people want it. So caffeine, I've done some work on the International Society of Sports Nutrition on one of the earlier ones on energy drinks. Published a study on energy drinks there. Time to exhaustion. We have had some more recent stuff published as coffee itself, and then also looking at energy drinks. So go to JISSN for a lot of that. You can find tons of data that's open access and easy to read on those things there. Also helped with the International Society of Sports Nutrition, caffeine and exercise performance. That one is really, really long, but it's all subdivided into different areas to read that at your own. Briefly, caffeine is an antagonist of the adenosine receptor. So it's basically where it's working. It can acutely be a substitute for sleep. The issue, though, is in sleep studies, the more tired people are, the more loss of awareness they have of being tired. So the running joke is you talk to sleep researchers and they put all these people in a dark room, have them do boring tasks. These are people who are like, oh no, I'm wide awake. I'm not really tired. And the running joke is within a few minutes, like some of them are just basically asleep. So the more tired you get, the more you lose the awareness of paradoxically being tired. Which caffeine can interfere with sleep. No shocker there. There are fast versus slow metabolizers of caffeine. You can get a genetic test to look at this. Most people probably know this without a genetic test, though. If you have caffeine in the morning and you have anything past noon and you can't sleep, you're probably a very slow metabolizer of caffeine, right? So most people probably know where they're at on the spectrum. This is compounded by there is a tolerance effect of caffeine over time. It does interact with the dopamine system, and the half-life can be quite different depending on sources, which we'll go over. The average amount of caffeine, it's about 155 milligrams of caffeine in a short 8-ounce cup of coffee. Now, again, there is a huge range on that. 235 milligrams in a tall 12-ounce cup of coffee. So a Starbucks Grande is 310. And then a Venti, don't ask me why Starbucks invented their own language. It drives me insane. Over 400 milligrams of caffeine. Now, again, these are on average, and there's a lot of variation within those. So those amounts are higher than what most people probably realize. This is one of my favorite studies done by McCusker. They took some grad student and sent him off to Starbucks every morning to purchase coffee. And the same Starbucks, the same general time, same brand, everything. And Starbucks is notorious for trying to standardize their process as best they can. And what they found was a huge range in caffeine content. So the mean caffeine content of their coffee there was a 16-ounce cup of coffee, was just under 200 milligrams of caffeine. However, when they did the lab analysis of this, it ranged anywhere from 259 to 564 milligrams per 16-ounce cup of coffee. Now, again, not everything was this high, not everything was this low. The average still came out to be around 200 milligrams. But I point this out because some people will say, oh, well, I used coffee before exercise or a big race, and it seemed to work one day and not the next day. It could be that there's a huge variation in caffeine. Now, again, this was from a standard location of caffeine, standard coffee, standard process. You start throwing in different processing, different times, different types of bean, light roast, dark roast, and you get a huge variation in caffeine content. Again, same coffee, same outlet. Again, this other study showed something very similar. So we always look for replication in different studies. So caffeine can change sleep architecture. It'll typically prolong what's called sleep latency. So if you have a really hard time getting to sleep when you lay down at night, caffeine, unfortunately, is not going to be your friend. It'll actually make that worse. Because of that, it can also reduce your total sleep time and can reduce your sleep efficiency also. It can worsen perceived quality of sleep also. So slow wave sleep and EEG slow wave were typically reduced, whereas stage 1 wakefulness and arousal were increased. That kind of makes sense of why people would use coffee. So if you want something that's a little bit different, if you use tea, you're going to get less caffeine overall. So green tea is about 30 to 50 milligrams. Black tea is maybe 50 to 60 or maybe a little higher. There is something called a pu'er tea that is a little bit higher. But what you can do is just put the tea bags in for about 60 seconds, take that out, and then rebrew that tea in a separate cup. The tea where you did just the 60-second brew, that'll have at least about 80 to 90% of the caffeine. This is what I call like the poor man's decaffeination method. There still will be some caffeine in the other cup, but not nearly as much. So if you're trying to reduce caffeine overall and you want a method to try to get a little bit more caffeine out of teas, that would be one way of doing it. There's also a great book, The History of Coffee by Michael Pollan, too. I had a question about the caffeine power nap. In my experience, if you do this, I like using a standardized form of caffeine, or what's called anhydrous caffeine, just a no-dose pill, 100 to 200 milligrams, and then sleep for 30 to 45 minutes. There is some data showing 90 minutes might be okay. You'll get through one sleep cycle. Most people feel that's a little bit too long. The peak onset of caffeine is going to be probably closer to that 30 minutes of the area. You could get super fancy and do like the Huberman non-sleep deep rest type of sleep if you want. And you wake up with peak levels of caffeine and you had a little bit of a nap. I did this to basically get through my entire PhD. Now, the caveat with this is I probably wouldn't do this anywhere close to bedtime. This would be like early afternoon if needed, because you still are introducing caffeine into your system. But in a worst case scenario, break the last for emergencies. I have done this and it does work quite nicely. Plus, you get a nap in. There are different ways you could micronize caffeine and different routes of delivery. Not saying I recommend any of these, but there is different half-lives of caffeine. Now, the average half-life for most people is about 6 hours. which is longer than what most people realize. Could be up to 10.7 hours. The big key here is in women is oral contraceptives in women will make a huge difference in your breakdown rate of caffeine. It took me forever working with a client a couple of years ago now that she couldn't go to sleep and we could not figure out what had changed. We went through her whole sleep routine. We checked her supplements. We had her down regulate. We had her get more light exposure. We had her do all this great stuff. And we could not figure out to get her to sleep. And I finally asked her, I said, okay, you on any different drugs, any other different medication at all? She's like, oh, I started taking an oral contraceptive. I was like, oh. So in this study, like the average sort of PK, so the how fast you're going to eat up caffeine was 6 hours. On oral contraceptive, that can go up to 11 hours. So she was still having the same amount of coffee like late to mid-afternoon, but now her body can't process it and break it down nearly as much. So she has higher levels of caffeine at night. She didn't change her caffeine intake at all. It was because she started taking an oral contraceptive. So that's happened to me a couple times now. So always ask about that because that can make a huge difference. And it is not very well known at all, but it is pretty well described in the literature. Like there's multiple studies that have replicated this. With a question, can you speed up caffeine if you took a bunch of caffeine and you want to go to bed? So one of the ideas I had for years was, oh, hey, if I'm going to do my lifting at 2 in the afternoon and I want to take 400 milligrams of caffeine, but I want to go to bed by 8 or 9 p.m., is there anything that can speed up my body's use of that caffeine? The short answer is not really. Like I've looked at everything into, bananas, exercise, water, can you flush it out? All the short answers would say probably not. And there has been studies that have looked at this. There is some interesting effects, maybe. I'd say it's very hypothetical on a certain class of carnivorous vegetables like broccoli, etc., because of cytochrome P450 activation. But in reality, it doesn't really seem to do much, to be honest. So not much there. There is one drug, but it does have a bunch of side effects. Here's the side effects of the drug. Temporary discoloration, itchiness, flushing, headache, drowsiness, dizziness, lack of coordination, difficulty concentrating. It's an old drug called Rimiftin. And it's by IV, I believe, too. So not orally available. Would not recommend it. I don't know why this drug does seem to speed up the use of caffeine, but that was I don't know, after God knows how many hours of reading research, I was like, the only one I could find. But again, not recommended. In this study, they did 10 healthy volunteers before and after a 7-day treatment with 600 milligrams of the drug. There was a significant change in caffeine plasma half-life. It went from 6.2 hours down to 3.5. So a pretty significant difference. But again, I would not recommend it for that. So in summary, where are we at? And I'll answer a couple of questions here. So sleep, very important for health. Coffee does have health benefits. Caffeine, shocker, will mess up with sleep. But having people do no caffeine, I think, is also very unrealistic. So what are we trying to do? We're going to try to mitigate sleep effects as best we can. Consider stopping caffeine use earlier. This is probably the big one. Again, this is also very dose dependent. Watch out for other drug interactions, especially oral contraceptives. And then if you can decrease caffeine dose and just see how it affects your sleep. And then have a set sleep time of when you need to go to bed, do some wind down, do some down regulation there. And this is my sister's dog, Bella. All right. So there you go. And again, the Flex Diet Cert is currently open right now. We've got 8 interventions. I think we've got 10 or 9 experts now. So you learn all about the big picture theory, action items for body composition and nutrition changes. We do cover carbohydrates. We do cover sleep and a bunch of other things there. So one of the questions about caffeine and L-theanine. So L-theanine may help with sleep on its own. I usually find the dosage is going to be a little bit higher than what most people use. Probably 200 to 300 milligrams by itself, maybe up to 400 milligrams. That's a pretty hefty dose. It can help with just a little bit better sleep quality. I've noticed that it's pretty variable. If you do have someone who has night terrors, Like remove them off of L-theanine immediately, because there's some people, I've only had this happen to like 2 people, and how long have I been using L-theanine now? Maybe 8 years, where they had night terrors, and as soon as they stopped taking L-theanine, it went away. It's not very common, but it can happen. So just FYI on that. But combining L-theanine with caffeine, that's not quite as popular now. But basically, it kind of mellows out the caffeine a little bit. So you've got one thing that's a little bit more of a stimulant, one thing that's a little bit more of a depressant, and then you get kind of evened out a little bit. Some people report that it kind of removes some of the jitters. The research on focus and concentration shows might be beneficial. I don't personally like it. That's just my opinion. But, maybe worth playing with. Usually it's a 2-to-1 ratio, sometimes a 1-to-1 ratio of caffeine versus L-theanine on that. Different types and sources of caffeine. Pretty much when you get down to it, caffeine is caffeine. However, the route of absorption will make a difference. If you are holding caffeine longer in your mouth, like you're eating one of the no-dose capsules, you can get some absorption directly through the mouth. So just be wary of that. But the other thing is where it's attached to. If you take green tea, for example, and you let it brew for a longer period of time, you will naturally get less caffeine because it gets bound up to the other compounds in green tea. But in general, it's going to be about the same. Now, there are on the market now metabolites of caffeine. One of them is called paraxanthine. So paraxanthine is the kind of one of the first metabolites of caffeine. Theophylline and theobromine are the other ones. And it's an interesting supplement. There's not too much data on it right now. It looks like from some early work that it will spike up and then kind of stay a little bit more plateauy and then drop a little bit more, where caffeine tends to be a little bit more kind of semi-linear in its progression. It'll be interesting to see if it has the same effects as caffeine overall. It does, in my experiments with it, with just a handful of people, does appear to be a little bit more predictable, meaning that I don't know if it follows the same fast or slow metabolizers of caffeine. It seems to have a little bit different curve. So I would say if you want to play around with it, go ahead. There's another form of caffeine that's not out on the market yet. It's called D9 caffeine. It's basically a molecular process that they treat the caffeine with, and they're able, it looks like, to change the PK curve on it. They can get it to stay elevated and then have much more of a sharper drop at the end. Yeah, there's some very interesting data on that. I talked to those guys about a year ago, so you can look that up if you're really interested in caffeine stuff there. So sources, probably not a huge difference. Type, probably not a big difference. But yeah, well, what other questions do you guys have that I can answer for you? Thanks, Jen. Appreciate it. Can caffeine help with ADHD? Oh boy. In my experience, it appears that stimulants in general can help with people with ADHD focus. I would put caffeine definitely in the stimulant area. Acutely, it does seem to help people I know who have ADHD. So I would say yes, but I don't think it's doing anything long term. I think it's just like most of the stimulants, whether you're using Adderall or Vyvanse or whatever, it just seems to, crank up that kind of sympathetic side of the spectrum and help people with ADHD focus more. I haven't seen anything that there's anything long-term benefit with that. So
I have a follow-up with that.
yeah, go ahead.
So I have ADHD diagnosed, and I get really bad like restless leg syndrome.
Oh yeah.
I find that especially on like I get on flights, I'll get it before bed sometimes. And if I have like a little bit of caffeine, like something around like 30 milligrams, like something like a Diet Coke or something, I find that it helps like immensely. Just kind of like, So I don't know. I don't really know exactly why. I've just heard like for ADHD, like stimulants calm you down. So I tried it one day and I was like, whoa, that worked. So I've just been kind of doing it ever since.
Huh. Yeah, interesting. I haven't heard of that, but if it appears to work, then yeah, go for it. Cool. Thank you for sharing. Appreciate that. Typical timing for performance and same here. Relaxes me. Yeah, very cool. Typical timing for performance and quantity. Oh, good question. If you look at the research for endurance performance, could start as low as 100 milligrams and kind of go up from there. If you look at strength and power, oof, 200 to 300 milligrams is kind of the bottom level there, and all the way up to potentially 600 milligrams or more. So again, it's going to depend upon the size of the human. Yes, the research in general, it's done, per body weight, but that's also offset by you've got people who may be larger mammals who have, faster versus slower metabolism of caffeine. So I usually tell people, like, for that, I'm going to use like a standard anhydrous caffeine, like a no dose or something that's standardized. Start low, start at 100, see how you feel and perform. Maybe go up by 50 milligrams or go up by 100 milligrams and just kind of play with it and see what you find. I know for myself, like if I am really doing like an all-out strength session or really like a test day on the rower, I'm probably at least at 400 milligrams. So I tend to be on the higher side of that. But there is definitely a top end where you get too much. It is what they call ergolytic, meaning it will impair performance on that. So I would tell people just start low and then slowly kind of go up, and you'll figure it out within, probably 4 to 5 doses, kind of where you're at. So, I mean, that I found in practice that's a little bit better than just giving the absolute ranges, because I've seen in practice there's a lot of variability from one person to the next. Last part, the higher doses tend to work better for more like gross motor activations. So things like powerlifting, 1RM attempts, short, high intensity intervals. You start getting into things that have a little bit more skill involved, even Olympic weightlifting. It's much more mixed at that point. Cool. Cool. Thanks, Jen. Appreciate it. Out of curiosity, what was the recovery for the 11 days without sleep? Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know. I wasn't able to find any research after the fact, but I would have to imagine that poor guy, is just wrecked for a while. I can tell you that I did the Race Across America. I was a support person for that. It's a bike race where you start in San Diego, California, and you go all the way out to Atlantic City, New Jersey is where we ended. And I think I slept 17 hours total that entire week. It was horrible. The first time I went to bed, I think I had been up for 48 hours straight because of a bunch of things happened. We had to take a guy off course, get IVs put back in him, all sorts of stuff. At the end of that, I remember telling the driver, like, I can't drive. Like, I am so impaired at this point that there's no way I'm driving a motor vehicle. And we finished the race, and I passed out on the concrete floor for like 4 hours in the fetal position. A couple people walked over and thought I might be dead to see if I was still breathing. I finally got up from that. We went to the hotel. We got third place. So everyone had this huge party in the hotel room that I was staying in. I literally crawled in the bed and pulled the covers over my head and said, you guys party all night if you want. I'm going to sleep. And I literally passed out for 12 hours. Still felt like shit the next day. I think it took me like 2 weeks to get back to feeling normal after that. So the other thing that was interesting about that too was day 3, I completely lost my short-term memory. I could not keep a memory in my head if my life depended upon it. I literally had to write anything down. So we would have this distance we would go and we exchange out riders. And so we were like, okay, let's go and exchange them out 11 miles. I would look at the odometer, and I had to have the person next to me write down the mileage because I couldn't remember, oh, did we just drop them off? Or how many more miles was it? I could not keep anything in my short-term memory at all. So how does caffeine affect blood sugar and insulin? Ooh, good question. Oh, the short answer is there's a huge debate on this. There is some early mechanistic data showing that high amounts of caffeine may temporarily reduce insulin sensitivity at the muscle level. Now, those doses were generally pretty high. We don't know chronically what happens with that. We do know that coffee tends to have the opposite effect, and that's probably because maybe the cholinergic acid and a bunch of stuff my good buddy Dr. Lonnie Lowry has published on, that may counteract that. So coffee doesn't seem to have that effect. So in theory, it might be an issue, but I put it in one of those areas where it's really theoretical at this point. I think if someone is doing huge amounts of caffeine, they probably have other issues to worry about. So personally, I don't worry too much about that. Blood glucose, maybe, but I haven't. In theory, you would think that it would be more profound, but in practice, I haven't seen that it's too profound. But there's some theories that as you increase caffeine dose, like blood sugar, blood glucose may go up. I haven't seen too much of an effect of that. I'm not convinced too much by the research on that. So, but yeah, great question. How does someone make sure they are not overdoing it on their carbohydrate intake? Ooh, good question from Ryan. In my biased opinion, you're looking for the happy medium of where they have enough carbohydrates to support high intensity exercise, but they're still reaching their body composition goals. So if they're really trying to gain more muscle and more mass, probably going to go higher on carbohydrates. Like we want to see body weight generally kind of going up, performance generally going up. Body comp will just kind of be where it is. You know, if you start getting way above the amount of carbohydrates you need, you'll definitely see body weight and body fat going up higher than the performance. Usually what's fascinating though is it's not a linear response. You know, I've had people up to 500-600 grams of carbohydrates and they were not gaining a ton of body fat per week. It seems like your body will oxidize more carbohydrates. The process of converting carbohydrates to fat is pretty intensive. Basically, it has to go through the liver, go through a process called DNO, de novo lipogenesis, and create fat, and that fat has to be stored. That can definitely happen. In humans, it's probably around single-digit percentage if you look at some of the older tracer studies that have been done on that. The prevalent theory is that the amount of dietary fat might actually be stored a little bit easier. So I'm a fan of, if you're a performance athlete really looking to push performance and body comp, baseline fat, 60 to 80 grams per day, high protein, and then just keep pushing carbohydrates up. If you're trying to get leaner, obviously you're going to have to start pulling carbohydrates down, but you're walking the balancing act the other direction, where you want to see body weight going down, body comp getting better, but we don't really want to start compromising performance until the very end unless we have to. At some point, if you're going to be a physique athlete and get on stage in your underwear, yeah, your performance at some point is going to take a hit. But we want to try to keep performance up as long as possible, which is also why I prefer diets that tend to be higher in carbohydrates and lower in fat. I'd rather have those calories coming from carbohydrates to fuel performance, where once you get beyond just the essential fatty acid levels and hormone production and things like that, testosterone for guys especially, you're not getting a ton of benefit from adding more fat to your diet. Again, assuming someone could be compliant with, you know, whatever you're asking, which compliance and all that stuff is a whole different ballgame. So yeah, very good question on that. Awesome. Cool. Any other last minute questions on anything I can help you out with? Let's see, I'll hit stop sharing here. Hey, I get to see people's faces now. That's pretty cool. Anything else from anyone? Going once? Going twice? Cool. Well, thank you all so much. Really, really appreciate it. If you like this, send me an email. Yeah, let me know your thoughts. We can do more of them if people are interested. I want to give you guys stuff that you're interested in. And yeah, Flex Diet's still open through Monday at midnight. If you have any questions or anything else on that, just hit me up over email. So if you like this, you would like all the great geeky content that's in there, hit me up with any questions. Thank you so much and have a wonderful day. We'll see you guys. Thank you.